I'm Cy, and welcome to part four of the Age of Ecosystems mini masterclass on LinkedIn Live. Ever so briefly, I'm a coach and consultant with a focus on transformation and change, where I partner with organizations to really help them calibrate their business models and operating models for impact. Just a little bit about my background. I've got more than 40 years of experience in practice and theory, as I like to say, theory-driven practice and practice-informed theory. I also encourage you to take a look at Conscious Agility from 2013, a book I published with two dear colleagues, and The Anti-Fragility Edge from 2016. The intent of this masterclass, and it is a mini masterclass again, is really exploratory exposure to the what, why, and how of ecosystems and how we can practically use ecosystem thinking to cultivate ecosystems and ecosystem enterprises to catalyze agility, resiliency, and anti-fragility, where the focus is really on insightful perspectives, actionable guidance, and impactful outcomes. In the last session, we introduced the pillars of ecosystems and really expressed them conceptually, concepts and principles. In this session, we're going to elaborate those principles and express them really operationally as practices, if you will. In part one, the anatomy of crises, we really explored how we become more crisis ready. And what we emphasized really is building crisis ready muscle using simulations. That was extremely key. In part two, we really focused on agility, resilience, and anti fragility. And we asked the fundamental question about how do we cultivate agility, resilience, and anti fragility. We explored the transnormal or in between muscle by exercising agility, resilience, and anti fragility muscles or muscle fibers. And we also explored how to discover, if you will, very critically, how to move toward the in between, moving away from the order side of the equation or the disorder side of the equation toward transnormality or the in between. That was extremely key. Very crucial in that exploration was really the shift from risk management to being more risk aware or risk savvy via stress, and likewise moving from risk taking to being more risk aware and risk savvy, and very much focused on really embracing a transnormal mindset or worldview relative to agility, resilience, and anti fragility. We're very, very crucial conversation, if you will, that we had that we are going to leverage, of course, in the conversation today very deeply. In part three, we really talked about ecosystem thinking and we focused on how to observe, if you will, and conceptualize ecosystems using concepts and principles. We established a worldview. And in particular, now in this part, what we are focused on is how to leverage this worldview, using it really to think about practices at individual, collective, and enterprise levels. Again, there is discovery that has to happen. So there is no simple silver bullet, if you will, to cultivate agility, resilience, and anti fragility, but very much so working with order, disorder, and really the in between via stress. If you have not taken a look at part one, two, and three, I highly encourage you to and revisit the recording if you're joining us live today before you dive in deeper, because we'll definitely be tapping into those key concepts, and in order for this to really be valuable to you. To summarize ecosystem thinking, we essentially said an ecosystem consists of stakeholders who are completely dynamic in their conversations, their relationships, their behaviors at all levels, individual, collective, and enterprise, and in every way. As stakeholders form an enterprise with an external ecosystem and with an internal ecosystem, the dynamics between the stakeholders and the dynamics uh, between the stakeholders, if you will, within the enterprise and the ecosystem externally determine the nature of the enterprise. We said an individual is fluid within the context of a set of collectives, a collective is in flow within the context of the enterprise, and an enterprise, if you will, is in flux within the context of the broader ecosystem, or really the ecosystem economy, as we can call it. So we also emphasize that an enterprise is an ecosystem enterprise, or an ecosystem organization, or an ecosystem business of collectives and individuals. And we also differentiated with how a lot of different folks are using the language, but very specifically in the way that we're using the language here. We also emphasized that the concepts of agility, resilience, and anti-fragility are degrees on a spectrum. They're properties of an object or of an individual, collective, or an enterprise. They're not quite absolute properties, and they're relative to a given situation, specific sources of stress, and certain ranges of exposures. So, as we think about these concepts, again, thinking about order, disorder, and the in between, we can think about agility, resilience, and anti-fragility uh, in reference to specific sources of stress, ranges of exposures, acuteness versus the chronic nature of that stress, and recovery time. Again, these are muscles that must be worked and built via stress. And that was extremely core to our conversation. Additionally, we looked at all these facets, but two principles in particular, the options experiments principles, that really is using heuristics around entrepreneurs that seek opportunities by exploring options and performing experiments, perhaps making small and reversible errors that cause acute stress, distributed over time with ample recovery time to seize those opportunities. And also the independence redundance principle, again, using heuristics really as explorers or adventurers to seek experiences where individually we can achieve uh, becoming more independent, and likewise being small and non-specialized, and collectively being more redundant, so we don't compromise by specializing or becoming dependent. And those are very, very key. So with all that background, and again building off of it, let's go ahead and talk about individuals. And we think about individual, if you will, operating within an ecosystem enterprise. It really comes down to leadership and being risk savvy, as we've really discussed in many different ways. Given an individual's intentions, how fluid are they? How do they navigate against opportunities and threats, given their strengths and weaknesses and that VUCA environment? Are they matching, if you will, the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats relative to that VUCA environment? How are they expending energy and time towards their intentions? How are they stressing themselves to achieve the in between, as we've talked about? How are they being stressed by others, and how are they stressing others? How are they being risk savvy and cultivating hygiene or integrity, if you will, within what they're doing relative to their conversations, relationships, and behaviors? And essentially, how are they expanding or limiting their ability to achieve greater adaptability, recoverability, or evolvability in exploring options and performing experiments? And likewise, how are they expanding or limiting their ability as such to be more independent and more redundant? Those are a lot of the questions that we really begin to think about when we think about leadership. Very, very critically expressed around UDA, around VUCA, around strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. If you think about leadership, and I'm sure listening to the recording or whoever is joined us today, you're thinking, well, leadership has other facets. Indeed, leadership is not merely about roles and responsibilities or organizational reporting structure or words like commitment and accountability, ownership and empowerment, or focus and discipline, or purpose and trust, or psychological safety, or no fault failure, or starting with why, or infinite games, or even talking about domains and decision making. It really fundamentally comes back to some of the things I've already mentioned. What I do encourage is, as you think about leadership, it really is about being strong, if you will, being real, being aware and savvy as an individual expresses that leadership within the context of collectives and the enterprise. Saying all that, we can look at an individual, take any individual, take yourself, and say which conversations, relationships, and behaviors cultivate the conditions, if you will, for you to explore options and perform experiments so that you can seek opportunities. Which ones also cultivate, if you will, being more independent and being more redundant within your environment, essentially seeking experiences. Similarly, we can ask which conversations, relationships, and behaviors do not cultivate those conditions for exploring options and performing experiments, or being more independent and being more redundant. Those are key questions that we can really begin to explore the agility, the resilience, and the anti fragility at the individual level. In particular, consider the capacity that the individual has. What's the degree of energy they have, the degree of awareness, both of themselves and others and their environment? What's the degree of competency, the skills that they have? What's the degree of capability that an individual has? Fundamentally, the ability to apply those skills efficiently in a disciplined manner and effectively in a focused manner to achieve their intentions or focus on their intentions. Furthermore, what degree of confidence, fundamentally belief in making all that happen? And ultimately, what degree of courage or the risk savvy nature of the individual to achieve to focus on their intentions and achieve the outcomes that they can within their context. Very, very critically, that's the way we can begin to explore individual agility, resilience, and anti fragility. Now, saying all that, making it real becomes crucial. And what I commonly suggest to folks is keep a journal, or if you work with a coach or work with someone, have them observe you. Note the conversations you have in your day, note the conversations you have in your week, the relationships that you exercise, the behaviors that you manifest. As you take note of all those things, now work with stress towards getting to the in between or toward the in between. What we commonly see is people are perhaps too order centric, or that's where their affinity is, and there's too much risk aversion. They're perhaps anchoring to low risk uh, initiatives or projects or products that they may be delivering, or services or experiences that they may be delivering into the marketplace. So in that way, they lose opportunities. They're not exploring their options, if you will. They're not performing experiments. They're fundamentally even putting others at risk by forming dependencies, if you will, on others, or others forming dependencies on them. They're not essentially being more redundant within the environment to reduce, if you will, the fragility or increase the anti fragility within the environment. That's one extreme. On the other extreme, again, we can see that individuals might be too disorder centric. In this case, there's too much risk taking. They're anchoring to a lot of high risk, if you will, initiatives or products or services or experiences that may be delivered, if you will, within the marketplace. Or maybe they're pursuing unrealistic opportunities, putting others at risk, perhaps, creating a dependency and not cultivating enough redundancy within the environment. These are the kinds of things that we can look at and explore through the conversations, the relationships, and the behaviors that an individual manifests. And that's very, very crucial then from the order centric or the disorder centric to really leverage stress, as we've talked about before, to move toward the in between. So, again, building on top of everything we've said, this is where individual agility, resilience, and anti fragility really begins to manifest. Let's look at this from a collective's perspective. Here, let's briefly talk about teams and teaming and communities. If you think about a team really is about common intent. It's less about individual and the identity of the individuals, but truly about common intent. Communities, however, is really more about common passions. And this is where there's more really about identity relative to the individuals belonging to a community. If you think about teams, essentially they're short lived, temporary groups. They're more focused on options and experiments as entrepreneurs and really seeking opportunities. Teaming is really about the fluidity of those individuals across teams. Thinking about communities, again, think about communities as having a common passion, individuals having a common passion. This is where it's more tightly associated with identity. They're more long lived or permanent groups. They're likewise more focused on really cultivating independence and redundance, if you will, as explorers seeking experiences. So this is where if you will, the principles begin to really converge around teams, teaming, and communities relative to collectives. In particular, we can think about, if you will, in both teams and teaming and communities, the integrating of tensions toward those groups coalescing. This is where conflict and tensions are very crucial. Tensions can be similarities and differences, independence, dependence, and interdependence. When we talk about integrating, what we're really saying is as you look at the world, if you will, we have to go from an either or perspective to a both and perspective. That's what integrating tensions is really all about. In this way, we can begin to generate high quality decisions and actions. It's not a question of better or worse, they're situational, but higher quality. The quality of the decisions and actions and the investment of time and energy, all those factors begin to play in. So if we think about collectives and leadership here, it's given a collective's intentions. How does the collective flow navigate, really UDA, if you will, against the opportunities and threats, given their strengths and weaknesses? Again, matching strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats within that VUCA environment, expending energy and time toward those intentions, stressing themselves as a collective toward the in between, being stressed and stressing other collectives and individuals, being risk savvy and cultivating hygiene, if you will, and likewise, what expands or limits that ability to achieve greater adaptability, recoverability, or evolvability through exploring options and performing experiments, and likewise, what expands or limits relative to being more independent and more redundant. Again, very crucial questions as we look at a collective. So, as we look at individuals and if you will, and ask ourselves which individuals cultivate the conditions for a collective as we're describing it, which ones don't. Additionally, which individuals cultivate, if you will, both at a team vantage point as well as a community vantage point, and which ones don't. As such, we can essentially take this thinking and really begin to observe an environment, note the collectives very practically, note the individuals, look at the teaming that's happening, look at the teams, if you will, look at the communities, and again, work with stress in that environment. If there's too much order centricity, perhaps too much risk aversion, anchoring to low risk initiatives, perhaps, where we see collectives not exploring options, not experimenting, fundamentally missing opportunities, potentially putting others at risks, and likewise, they don't become independent enough and perhaps not enough redundancy within the environment is what they cultivate ultimately. That's perhaps on the two order centric side. On the two disorder centric side, there may be too much risk taking. A collective may be pursuing high risk goals or objectives, if you will, fixating on opportunities, putting others again at risk, perhaps too much independence as a collective. They go rogue even to that extreme, and perhaps they're on another vantage point, maybe building too much redundancy, expressing themselves within the environment so that even that rogueness can be overly redundant within the environment. So again, thinking about a collective as a community or a team and teaming relative to the fluidity of the individuals, we can really begin to think about how do we leverage that stress to move that collective towards the in between. Again, very much leveraging a lot of the conversations we've talked about before relative to stress. Let's go ahead and talk about enterprises, enterprise ecosystems. Here, there's two core concepts that we really want to hone in on. And I'm going to briefly introduce them here, but please keep in mind there's a lot more depth than what I'm going to describe here. Essentially, individuals, collective, and enterprises really have a life cycle. And that life cycle can be really viewed from a front loop and a back loop. The front loop really focuses on growth and stability. It's a comparatively, it's a longer, slower period of time where, if you will, an individual, a collective, or an enterprise progresses through growth and maturation. Progressively, it becomes more order centric, perhaps less adaptive, less recoverability, and less evolvability, ultimately becoming too rigid and maladaptive, malrecoverability, or malevolvability, and then abruptly collapses. Then that goes into the back loop. In the back loop, there's a focus on change and disruption and variety. Comparatively, it's a shorter, faster period of time where the individual, collective, or enterprise really progresses from release in that collapse to reorganization and inherently more disorder centric and more adaptability, recoverability, and evolvability begins to manifest, ultimately being reborn in that process of rebirth. So the frontal loop and the back loop, very much a life cycle. That's a very key concept, and I've just barely touched the surface in introducing it here. Additionally, if we think about individuals and collectives and how they form an enterprise ecosystem here, we have the notion of panarchy or scales, if you will. Here, we're talking about a hierarchical nested set of life cycles. This is not an organizational reporting structure of any sorts, but rather a nested set of life cycles. At each level, individual, collective, and enterprise, at each level, there is a life cycle at its own pace. Each level, if you will, is protected from above by a slower, larger cycle, which provides really order and stability, and is also invigorated from below by a faster, smaller cycle, which generates disorder and innovation. Here, you immediately recognize the order side, the disorder side, and the in between. That's where the particular level we might be talking about exists, whether it's individual, collective, or enterprise. Note the tension between order and stability and protection, and disorder, innovation, and invigoration. Very key words, very similar to what we've talked about in the other conversations. Now, if we bring in the front loop and the back loop, the front loop again, growth and maturation, the back loop being release or death, and reorganization or renewal. Here now, when at a particular level, when in that cycle we enter a release, it may trigger a revolt, if you will, a pull to disorder in the slower, larger cycle, in the more order centric cycle, the one that's above, if you will. The faster, smaller, disorder centric cycle overwhelms the slower, larger, order centric cycle, and it can further cascade upward. Now, when a cycle enters at a particular level, the reorganization, if you will, time horizon, it is influenced by a remember or a pull to order from the slower, larger, if you will, order centric cycle. And the slower, if you will, the slower, if you will, order centric cycle constrains the smaller, faster, disorder centric cycle. So you begin to quickly recognize the dynamic here. There's a tension between order constraining top down and disorder overwhelming bottom up. Fundamentally, we've used the words around order, stability, protection. We've used disorder, innovation, invigoration, and we've used, if you will, pull to disorder relative to revolt and pull to order in terms of remember. All of this really is about the in between, the life cycle piece of it, the scale piece of it, from the order side, this order side, moving us toward the in between. And again, the stress conversations, we've talked about leveraging stress, if you will, for agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Again, I realize there's a lot of terminology here, and I'm again just barely touching the surface of these concepts, but just enough to move us toward move the conversation forward in this session. So now, if we think about leadership at the enterprise level, given an enterprise's intentions, how does the enterprise flux, if you will, navigate or OODA against opportunities and threats, given strengths and weaknesses? How is it matching those strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats in that VUCA context, in the enterprise ecosystem environment, if you will? Is it expending energy and time toward its intentions and achieving outcomes? How is it stressing itself, if you will, really its parts, its collectives and individuals into the in between? That's becomes very, very crucial. Is it being stressed by others, and if you will, and stressing other ecosystem enterprises? Again, as an enterprise, being risk savvy and cultivating hygiene. This is very, very crucial to the conversation is hygiene, especially at the enterprise ecosystem level through symmetry, as we're talking about, and variety, as we'll see. And likewise, what expands or limits the enterprise's ability to explore options and perform experiments through its collectives and individuals? Or what expands or limits its ability, if you will, to be more independent and more redundant, if you will, through its collectives and individuals within its context? Again, this is towards adaptability, recoverability, and evolvability. Given all of that, let's dive in a little bit deeper. And we really begin to ask ourselves as we observe an enterprise, which collectives and individuals cultivate the conditions for exploring options and performing experiments, being more independent, being more redundant? Which collectives and individuals do not cultivate those conditions? Again, those are very crucial and similar to the questions we've asked at the collective level and the individual level. So now putting this into practice, how does it begin to manifest? Well, we observe the environment, observe the enterprise, observe the individuals, the collectives, observe the dynamics, the conversations, the relationships, the behaviors, the focal points around which we organize, whether they're initiative, projects, etc. And we've talked about these, the way that navigation and synchronization manifest, the fluidity of individuals, the flow of collectives, and the flux that happens throughout the enterprise. And then we work with stress towards the in between. If we think about the enterprise as a whole, how does it grow? How does it mature? How does it release and reorganize its collectives? How do they flow, if you will? Again, there isn't a suggestion to do a reorganization every quarter, every year, if you will, but rather there should be a natural flow of collectives within the context of the enterprise. If you think about the collectives, whether they be teams or communities, how do they grow? How do they mature? How do they release and reorganize the individuals involved so that the individuals can be fluid within the enterprise? Again, very key questions relative to the collectives. And observing an enterprise, we can begin to see that. Look at the individuals within the enterprise. How do they grow, mature, and release and reorganize their conversations, their relationships, their behaviors, if you will, all the things we've talked about? This is all about the in between at each level and the leveraging of stress, as we've talked about, to go from the order centric side or the disorder centric side toward the in between. And we've talked, if you will, in the other sessions about how to leverage that stress. We can observe and we can ask ourselves, is there a lack of fluidity? Is there a lack of flow? Is there a lack of flux? Is there too much stagnation? Likewise, is there extreme fluidity? Is there extreme flow and extreme flux? There's too much fragmentation. And again, how do we leverage stress to begin to move toward the in between? It's very crucial, again, why I emphasized in the beginning of this session the previous conversations as a foundation to this session. Let's continue the conversation even further. Working with stress as you look at the enterprise very practically and helping an enterprise move towards the in between. Consider how, at the enterprise level, the enterprise provides order or stability and hygiene or enough stress to its collectives so that they don't stagnate. If you think about the collectives themselves, whether they be teams or communities, how do they provide orders and stability and hygiene again for the individuals so the individuals don't stagnate? Additionally, how do those collectives, whether they be teams or communities, generate disorder and innovation and likewise invigoration and stress, if you will, within the enterprise so that other collectives don't stagnate? Again, we don't want to go toward the stagnation or the fragmentation, but that's why we talk about the right degree of hygiene, if you will, the in between. As you explore the individuals, how do they generate innovation and disorder ultimately into the collectives and ultimately into the enterprise? And again, the degree of hygiene and stress within that collective and across the enterprise. In this case, this is all about the in between across the levels. So, as I mentioned, the in between at each level and the in between across the levels. And as you observe, if you will, an enterprise, there may be too much order, too much structure, too much process, or too much disorders, lack of focus and discipline, too much stagnation or fragmentation. Again, we leverage stress to move toward the in between, as we've discussed. Additionally, we can say, well, there's not enough hygiene. And hygiene is a very, very key word, as I've mentioned. It really is leveraging, if you will, stress to cultivate, very critically, symmetry within the environment, within a particular context, and likewise, variety at the same time. Are we exploring new conversations at the individual level? Are we exploring new relationships? Are we exploring new behaviors, if you will? And you could look at it that way. And what we might observe is that there isn't enough hygiene in this case. Uh, very, very, very critically, individuals, collectives, enterprises generally don't handle release or death and reorganization or renewal very well. So this is where we leverage stress again very critically to help an ecosystem enterprise or an enterprise ecosystem really begin to embrace these key concepts and become its best. So if we begin to think about all these things to cultivate a healthy ecosystem, or ecosystem is right, we use stress and catalyze agility, resilience, and anti-fragility as we've been discussing. Transformation is fundamentally a harmonization, if you will, or a rebalancing of energy to generate power externally. And what it is experienced as a redistribution of power internally. And that redistribution of power, if you will, is in honor of all the tensions towards catalyzing agility, resilience, and anti fragility, or really adaptability, recoverability, and evolvability. Being too order centric, we get risk aversion. Being too disorder centric, we get risk taking. And again, leveraging stress to return to the in between, being risk savvy. We've talked in the previous sessions about how to do a lot of that here. Now the pieces begin to come together very much through leadership, through conversations, relationships, and behaviors, through teams, teaming and communities, and leveraging of tensions and conflict, and really the cultivation of ecosystem enterprises. With all that being said, look forward to part 5, transcending into an ecosystem enterprise. Again, I'm Sai, and thank you for joining part 4 of the Age of Ecosystems mini masterclass. Thank you.